Good morning and welcome to our worship today here at Monte Vista. I'm glad that you are either here in person or you are watching us online, whatever way you are connecting with us, we're glad you made the decision to do that. It was probably in the last year or so I've started noticing that we have experienced a lot of grief in our congregation. Whether it's a death of somebody that we are close to, a loved one, a family member, or a friend, or whether it's the losses that we've experienced from COVID, or whether it's relationships or dreams that have died, whatever it may be, that idea of loss seems to permeate all of us in ways that we end up grieving, and it's a common denominator for us. And so I invited a good friend to be here today. So our service is going to be a little different than what we have done before. Gregg, and Randy and I met back in seminary. Our wives worked together in the same office, and that's how we were introduced and we became friends. They have 2 daughters, we have 2 daughters, so our lives have intersected over the years as we have raised children and just always been connected to each other's lives, and they have been good friends. A few years ago, Randy walked through that valley of the shadow of death as his own wife died. And that began to turn his ministry into looking at grief and how we deal with it, understand it, work through it. And so he has been a pilgrim in this journey. And so I've invited him to come and share with us this morning on just what that means and how we, some healthy ways that we can get through it ourselves and what that looks like. So I know you're going to be tremendously blessed and glad that you are here today. He has something for all of us. And so he's going to be coming in a moment. But before he comes, we're going to sing together, worship, crown him with many crowns. And so Cliff's going to lead us. Would you stand and let's sing together.
Crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon his throne. Hark how the heavenly anthem drowns all music but its own. Awake my soul and sing for him who died for thee.
Good morning, everyone. So good to see you. I've enjoyed this trip and visit with Kim and Jerry. We did meet at Southern Seminary, what feels like yesterday, but it's been a few years ago. My wife, Diane, worked with Kim in the admissions office at Spalding College. Jerry and I did not know each other, but we met in the student lounge. We may have even had a class together too, but we would meet and have coffee and talk in between classes. I really enjoyed him. Diane met Kim, really enjoyed her, and so separately we met each other, and then Diane would come home and say, I have met the most delightful person, and I want us to get together and go out to eat. And then when we got our heads together, only then did we realize that it was Kim and Jerry. And so we went to seminary in 1979. Our Lindsay was, I think, around 18 months old then, so Kim and Jerry would babysit Lindsay, and our friendship has just grown through the years. It's like we have, whenever we get together, we just pick up right where we were. Their hospitality has been so gracious and kind this weekend, and so I've looked forward to coming and meeting with you and sharing something that I hope will be helpful to you. I do want to put a footnote out here at the beginning. If you are in early grief, meaning if you have lost someone in recent weeks or months, I don't want any of my words to be triggers for you to cause you to be uncomfortable. I just want you to know I'm going to be talking about loss and grief, but I'm going to do it in what I hope will be a very kind way, so that you would be able to learn, understand it better, and hopefully find a way forward with whatever this setback or detour might happen to be. In the spring of 2019, my Diane began to have some lower back and abdominal pain, and it would show up in various ways and at different times. And so it became so persistent that we decided we'd go to the doctor, and we did. And one doctor would try this protocol, and that didn't work. And then we would go to another doctor, and then we pursued that for quite some time, not finding a resolution or a source of the pain. And then finally, one doctor referred us to a neurologist because the description of the pain was it was nerves on the abdomen, which almost sounded like shingles to me, but I'm not a doctor. And the neurologist ordered another MRI. And then when he called on a Wednesday afternoon, August the 14th of 2019, and he said, your back is fine, but there is a mass on your pancreas. We called our girls, they came home, we all collapsed into each other's arms. And there began a journey that took us into the world of doctors and tests and radiation and chemo. Initial words were that it was inoperable, but we were persistent, and we found a surgeon in Milwaukee that was world-renowned. We went up there many times. He was so delightful, so supportive, and so caring. And we had a plan. The plan was that we would come back in May of 2020, and he would remove her pancreas. And then we would use, I think, like an insulin pump and medication to regulate all of that stuff that would go with it. When we went back in March, it was March of 2020. When we went back in March, it had metastasized to 2 different places. And in that news, another turn in the road began, and that was sort of a slippery slope. And we could not do as much chemo. August the 4th, a little bit before 10 o'clock in the morning, Diane took her last breath. Surrounded by us, her me, our girls, our son-in-laws, and our 4 grandchildren. It was pretty rugged and it was pretty raw. And in that experience, our lives were changed. Now, what I have just shared with you is my pain story. Pain. We all have them. Yours may not be the same as mine. Probably not. It may be the story of a diagnosis and treatment. It may be an accident. It may be a lingering illness. It may be any other limitation that has happened. I truly believe that we all have a story in our mind of how life is going to go and what's going to happen and where we will arrive, and it will be the place that brings us so much joy and happiness. And then life comes along, and it doesn't end our story, but it changes our story. And what it changes is something we never imagined. And so in desperation, well, let me take those words out. Edit, delete, take those out. In those initial days and weeks and months, nothing but shock was there. And I think God gives us shock to protect us from the reality and the depth of what's really taking place. And so as the shock begins to minimize and you start realizing, okay, this is the landscape of what I'm working with here, what are you going to do? And that's when I began looking for resources for me, but especially for my children and my grandchildren. Because their presence there created this memory. And I knew that memory would linger unless we could find a way to help them process it. Somewhere in there, I found the work of Dr. Alan Wolfelt out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And he's written a number of books, and he's an expert on thanatology and loss and grief. And I read some of his books, and especially one called Companioning the Bereaved, and when I read it, I knew that resonated on a deep level. So I signed up for some workshops, went out there. And then I found such a positive opportunity. We sat in classroom with a group of 35 to 40 people from all over the country. Now, what I've shared with you is my pain story and then my searching story. This is the beginning of the searching story. Looking for something that will help me understand what has happened. And in that training program and the training programs that followed, it was truly eye-opening and life-changing because I thought I knew grief. I had been a minister for over 40 years. I had been with people who had lost loved ones, and I had helped with their funerals and memorial services. I had read some books, and I thought, not that I was an expert, but I thought I was better acquainted with it than what I was. The only illustration I could think of that might help you is, it seems there's a big difference between walking with someone up to a roller coaster and watching them get on the roller coaster, and then you're there when they get off of it. It's very different when you're the one that gets on that roller coaster. And suddenly that experience that you have watched others have, suddenly you're having yourself. And so what I learned from Dr. Wolfelt is something that I want to use as sort of a structure for what I'm saying here. And the phrase is, or the sentence is quite simple. If we grieve well, we can mourn well. And if we mourn well, we can live well. If we grieve well, we can mourn well. And if we mourn well, we can live well. So I want to unpack that a little bit for you, or with you. When loss happens, Anytime we lose something or someone we love, we grieve. Quite often, we limit that sense of loss to the loss of a loved one, and that's the largest and the biggest one. We lose a spouse, we lose a child, we lose a sibling, we lose a grandchild. We could lose a teacher. We lose someone of influence in our life. Depending on that relationship, how long we've known them, it can have a tremendous impact on us. But anytime we lose, we grieve. And grief in itself is its own process. We lose a loved one. We lose a relationship. Maybe we were tight and close with people, and over the years, drift apart. That could include family. We lose a job or career. We lose a dream. We have a dream of where we want to go vocationally or as a family or just as a person. Something comes along and we can't do that dream anymore. I have a grandson that's deeply committed to playing basketball on the college level, but he's not gotten a scholarship, and so he is pursuing training to become, hopefully, to where he could get a scholarship or at least an opportunity to play. That's his dream. As his papa and a minister, I'm watching and wondering, what do we do if that dream doesn't become a reality? And so we will be there and we will love him. But again, dreams get lost too. Changing our health. As we age, I'm noticing a lot of things. I don't think Jerry will mind me saying this because it really doesn't matter. He can't keep me from saying it. But when the three of us were together, we were telling old stories and old memories. And there were occasions that it took all three of our memories to get one story together. So we would start with something way over in right field, and then here we would go, and eventually we got it enough propped up to where we could hear it or believe it anyway. A loss of independence. You know, there's something about being able to come and go as we please, and then as age comes along or other limitations. And then there's also miscarriage or infertility. I had the privilege, and this is just a short list. Anytime you lose, you grieve. Loss of a pet. I have been deeply exposed to Maggie, the other man-tooth that you may not know. But Maggie has her own personality. But we grow very close to them, and they minister to us in ways sometimes that humans can't. But when we lose a pet, it also registers on our scale as well. So in a sense, all of us are grieving about something right now, something or someone. And we have our pain stories that we bring with us. And we have our searching stories that we bring with us. So there's lots of ways to lose, and when we lose someone, I'm going to keep it on the losing a person level, it's going to impact us on different levels all of the time. On a physical level, we lose their presence. But that grief will impact us physically by getting tired. We can rest or not rest. We can eat too little or eat too much. It affects us mentally because we do get anxious, we get confused, we get overwhelmed. It can impact us emotionally. We feel sad, we'll feel lost. It affects us relationally because we sort of pull back to be in our little shell of protection, and the people around us want to help and they want to say something that will be helpful. And yet, what do you say? There are not any words that will take away the pain or keep us from feeling what we're feeling. So it affects us mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. But it can also affect us spiritually, because as rock solid as our faith may be, as regular as our church attendance may be, when life hits us with this unexpected event, it's going to shake us all the way down to the core of our being. And it is quite natural to have questions. Where was God? Why did God not answer this prayer? Why did he not show up? Why are these things here? And so grief is a natural and normal experience of life. I want to say that over and over again. Grief is a natural and normal experience of life. In fact, we should grieve. We should grieve because we love. And grief is the other side of love. The reason we grieve so much is because we loved so much. So in this huge impact, there's some other things, and this is more teaching now, and I'll get a little bit more into application in just a second, but how does grief affect us? It affects us because we lose our identity. The first time I had to fill out a form, whether it was with the doctor or getting my driver's license renewed, the question was, what is your marital status? And I went, oh man, that stinks. I am married, and yet I'm not married. And so there is the reality of, who are we without them? Because Diane and I were such a close team. Without that person, there's a part of you that's missing as well. So we lose some of our identity. We lose our safety. Our world is pretty calm and steady. We love our routine. We like the flow of life. We like how things are working out for us. And then when a loss comes along, and it doesn't end our story, but it changes our story, then we don't feel quite as safe. We don't feel quite as confident. Something has shaken us to the very core of our being. And then we lose some sense of trust in the world because our world suddenly changed from normal, predictable, to uncertain and not knowing. So I want you to hear that loss creates grief. Grief is natural and it's normal. It's to be expected. Yet grief comes in many different forms, and I'm going to share a very brief list here, but just a brief list. One is called anticipatory grief. That is when you're grieving ahead before an event happens. So if you have someone who has a disease or like cancer, you can see the handwriting on the wall, and it's like you can anticipate there's going to be a change here. And that's anticipatory grief. Then there's traumatic grief. And traumatic grief is when we lose someone, and it's how they die or when they die. If we lose a grandchild or a child, that's traumatic grief because it's out of sequence. Two of my best friends in Madison, the little town where I live in Georgia, Karen and Alan have 3 daughters, and their oldest daughter had 2 children, and their little Millie developed a very rare form of cancer. And I have walked with them, and I feel their heartbeat because that is so traumatic. It's out of order. It's out of sequence. And the bottom line is, in our world, it really shouldn't have happened, and yet it did. And then the last one is ambiguous grief. Jerry, I've talked too much about COVID and the impact it has had on us. That's a form of ambiguous grief. It simply means there wasn't any closure to it. Diane died during COVID, and our graveside service was limited by those guidelines that said you can only have this number of people there. My dear friends Pat and Charles, he had leukemia, and he took a turn, his health took a turn about the same time Diane did. And he was in intensive care at Emory Hospital in Atlanta, and Pat and her children could not visit with him. So Charles took his last breath as the nurse was holding a cell phone, and Pat and her boys were talking to him. What that means is it's ambiguous grief. There wasn't a closure to it. Even now, when she and I talk, there's so much that goes on with what happened then. Randy, do you remember Charles was in the hospital? I do. Do you remember we couldn't? I do. How are you doing, Pat? So this is grief. That's a quick little introduction. More information than you wanted to know, I'm sure, and you probably won't remember it. But I do have a handout here that gives you some resources if you choose to read more. I have some of the books I'm going to have in the fellowship hall, not to sell. I don't sell books and I don't get anything from it. But I'm going to have some books in the fellowship hall you can look at and say, oh, I might want to read that. Then you can go to Amazon and order it if you choose to. All of that's grief. If we grieve well, what does that mean? What does it mean to grieve well? Because we have all this head knowledge about grief. Okay, I get it. Loss, grief. There's different forms of it. It impacts us in different ways. What do I do with that grief? Excellent question. Because I'm going to come back with, what are you going to let that grief do to you? Because grief drops us almost like in this wilderness of life where our GPS doesn't work. We don't have any directions. It's a foreign language. It's a different setting. It's a different everything. So what do? Well, in our culture wants to push back and say, you just need to get over it. Meaning, there's nothing to it. You got to go back to work. You got to get on with life. You got to pay the bills. You got to make these decisions. Our culture also says, be strong, be independent. Just face it and go on. Even in church. I have no agenda against church, but I want you to think about some of the things that people have said to you, or confessionally, some of the things I have said to people, such as it was God's will. God had a plan. There was a reason for it. Let me tell you the problem with all of those. We are denying the person the right to feel a natural and normal experience. We're suggesting that they bypass it. Let's go on and think about them being in heaven. And that is great comfort. It holds us steady and it holds us close. But at the same time, there's a sequence to it. We need to experience what we're experiencing. We need to feel what we feel so that we can heal it. So grief is natural and it's normal. How do we grieve? We face it. We lean into it. It's uncomfortable. We listen to it. Grief, in the beginning, I thought grief was the enemy. I thought grief was the stranger that walked up the front walk to my house, knocked open the door, stole my best seat, and took over the remote control of my life. Because it seemed to be that grief was everywhere. With time, I'm beginning to see that grief is the other side of love. Grief is putting up the markers of where Diane was present to me and is no longer there. Grief invites me to sit with the memory, to go back. And one of the great things that have happened with my visit with Kim and Jerry has been being able to go back and pull back some of those memories. Because when we pull them back, then Diane is right there with us. We can't hear her laugh and we can't see her, but she's close again. And that means everything. So what do we do with our grief? If we grieve well, we have to lean into it. We have to face the uncomfortableness of it. We have to tell the stories over and over again. So if we grieve well, that's my grief story. And it has many more layers to it, too many to share here, but there's the pain story, the searching story, the grief story. If we grieve well, we can mourn well. So what does that look like? Mourning, and this was where I learned something new. This was probably one of the biggest takeaways from all the training, is grief is energy. Grief is energy. And the energy is love that we want to share with someone, probably the person that we lost. But we can't do it. But the energy's there physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. All of those dimensions. So where does it go? And so mourning is the outward expression of the inward grief. Grief is energy. Grief is naturally normal. It creates energy. What do we do with that energy? If we don't lean into the grief, then we continually play that pain tape over and over again. Now, there's great joy in watching some of the TV shows we watch that we really like, and you can watch it over and over again. But even those get boring after a while. And I realized I was sharing my pain story everywhere I went. And then it dawned on me one day, I don't think the checkout lady at the grocery store wants to hear that. Because I would pull that story out and just tell anybody. And then I thought, no, dying was more than pain. Your life was more than pain. There's more to it. And so when I heard grief is energy, mourning is expression or allowing that energy to go outward. So how do we do that? How do we mourn well? Some of it is built into some of the traditions that we have. After the death of a loved one, we have a funeral. Funeral is a great opportunity to gather with people who love and support us, to read Scripture, talk about that person, let their story be shared and come to life. That's a form of mourning. After the funeral, then unfortunately we sort of get back to life, at least those around us do, while we feel like our life is anchored right back here to that day and time and place. So we have to come up with new ways of mourning, of letting it out. I am totally committed to making sure I don't have to worry about my children, but I do have some concerns about my grandchildren, that they will remember Diane. So one of the things I did early on, she died in August of 20, and December of 20, that first Christmas, I took some of her clothes and had someone turn them into a teddy bear. And I will have to tell you that when Diane died in 20, so Caroline was 8, Grant and Lily were 11, and Harrison was 15. When I gave them those teddy bears, it was like they were 3 and 4 years old again. They hugged them, and to this day, they're still on their beds. So that was a way of taking the grief, helping them remember, and let it become a form of mourning. Diane also was deeply committed to Christmas. Deeply. Did you hear me say the word deeply committed to Christmas? It was her time of year. So we had all the decorations, and you can imagine how much I contributed to the decorations. Guess low, guess really low. But she was highly committed to it, and she made it so special. And one of the words that she passed along to our girls was, don't let anybody steal your Christmas. And so they've taken that to heart. Now, I will tell you in my confessional moments that there was a time I didn't think so much about Diane. I didn't like her as much after she died. And that was when I decided to move from a bigger house to a smaller house. And I had to deal with an attic full of Christmas. And I thought, girl, where are you now? But in that loss of her and her Christmas, I had an aha moment. And the aha moment was, I'll make Christmas year round. So I have a Christmas tree in the den with some of her ornaments on it, and I have her nativity scenes up, and we'll start playing Alabama Christmas music probably about the middle of August. And so mourning is our way of expressing it. And there's so many different ways because we are different and our grief is different and our relationship to that person is different. So our mourning needs to be different. Something that they loved and found meaningful, whether it would be planting a tree, creating a garden, donating to a certain cause, volunteering for an effort. Wherever you think their passion for life was, you can support it. And so grieving needs to be expressed in some form of mourning. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for mourning today. We have fast food restaurants, and somehow we sort of think we ought to have a fast food life, but we don't. Grief demands that we stop and slow down and pull off on the side of the road and pay attention to it and listen. The bad news is we will grieve for the rest of our lives. The good news is we should, because our love for the person didn't end. It continues. The relationship is still there. It's just not a physical relationship. It's one filled with memories. And those memories are packed in a story. So when you hear a person in grief telling their story, they're sharing something important with you. And it's a good time to pay attention. With grief comes a lot of guilt. And the guilt is, did I do enough? Should I have done more? But we bring that guilt even into the loss process. Am I doing this right? And we'll look around and say, but that person over there seems so strong. It's like they've got everything together. I don't seem to have it together. Well, one of the books that I have on the list, and I have to show you when we're over in the fellowship hall, is It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. And she lost her partner in a boating accident. And out of it, she ran into the culture in which we live and some of the resistance. And so her message is, it's okay. It's okay that you're not strong today. It's okay that you don't want to get out of bed. It's okay that you don't have an answer to that question. It's okay to be where you are, because where you are is where you need to be. And that's okay. And it's such a powerful message, I think, for the grieving process and the mourning process and the future process. So what do we do with our grief? We pay attention to it. We lean into it. Let it remind us of who we loved and where we loved them. Form a trusted and safe support system, even if that's just one person. Practice self-compassion and self-care. And listen for the gentle and tender movement of God's Spirit in holding you as you walk through the tension of life. So if we grieve well, we mourn well. And if we mourn well, we live well. Live well doesn't mean we get our person back, but we do figure out a way to take them forward with us. And there is a future out there. We don't always want to walk into it because we have to go without our person, and yet there can be ways we take them with us. Early on, Dinah and I were talking, and she wanted a scripture that she could quote every day that would give her comfort and strength. And so we searched, and she selected 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. I never asked why. She didn't. I need to introduce you to her. She was 5'3", blue eyes the color of blue jeans, blonde, curly, wavy hair. Just a beautiful spirit, full of sparkle and life and adventure. When she woke up in the morning, she was 220 volts instantly. Me, I couldn't even find the plug and the outlet on the wall. And I would fuss at her and say, you need to just give me time. I want to wake up. I just can't do that yet. She'd say, okay, I won't move. Next morning, I could feel her wake up. It's like her eyelids shot a bolt of lightning out. And I'd look over there and she would have the cover over her head and her eyes are wide open. And she would say, I didn't move. I miss that person. And that person walked into the diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. She walked through the chemo and the radiation, all the twists and turns that brought with it. And every day she would quote, "For God has not given me a spirit of fear." I never saw fear in her, but of power. Her power wasn't that kind of power that overcomes the disease. It endured the demands of the disease. And of love. She was so loving. Everywhere we went, she was the spark that drew people to us. And of a sound mind. All the way to the end, that was her. And then that was in the morning. And then in the evening, we would ask each other, where did you see God today? And it was always people. People with names. Dr. Douglas Evans in Milwaukee showed grace, compassion, kindness, and tremendous support, even with the diagnosis that we had. Debbie Lamb, a retired teacher, she had worked with my Lindsay for a number of years, and she, on her own initiative, would bake this Coca-Cola cake. Some of you may do that. If you do, you're my favorites. And it has this gooey fudge icing on top, and she would put it in a foil pan with a foil lid on it. And then she would write on the top of it, "Dear heart, this is prepared in love. Eat it and know that you are loved as well." If she brought one, she brought 50. Mary DeLetto was a neighbor who lived across the street. We had very little in common with them. And yet, when Diane was diagnosed, every week she brought a flower arrangement of flowers that were blooming in her yard. Every week. Bill and Michelle Baker, our friends that have been with us for a long time, flew in from Dallas, Texas every time there was a prayer meeting or there was a worship service or there was some special event. And so if we grieve well, we mourn well, and we can live well. Because even in the darkness and even in the confusion, there is the presence of God. And I believe that God is present in the pain. I believe that He is present in the suffering, even when it's not removed. And I believe He's present in the healing. So how do you live well? How do you live well after loss? I think you have to acknowledge the loss and say, someone I loved and adored has died. I miss them more than anything in the world. And yet they're not here. Then I think we have to embrace the potential for moving forward. Now, here's the hiccup with that. We don't want to move forward without them. And you don't have to. They are in every story, and they are in every memory that you have. And they're as close as your breath, and they're always there, and they always will be. Acknowledge the pain of the loss, embrace the potential for growth, and then look for new opportunities to share joy, for relationships, and fulfillment. Yes, it's different. It's not the story we thought we would live, but it's the story we've got. And I truly believe that when we walk this path, we learn some of the deeper lessons of life. We learn the truth about who we are and how beautiful and kind people are around us and how much we need community and connection with other people and how much we all want our pain to be heard. In September, I went out to training in Sedona, Arizona, because Dr. Joanne Cacciatore had written the book, Bearing the Unbearable, and I'd read it and devoured it and loved it. And she was presenting the material, and in that material, she said, we often ask, why did this happen? And she said, that's a question we can't always answer. So let me give you another question. Why am I still here? And that's not a question we can answer quickly or lightly, but we have to sit with. For me, I believe I'm still here to love my people, to love others, to create a safe place for people to talk about their pain. And beyond that, I don't know much, but I do believe the doors will open for what that needs to look like. Thank you so much for the opportunity and privilege to be here. I am so sorry that you have had loss. I am so sorry that you have had pain. And I'm so sorry that your story has changed. But I am here to say your story is not over. It's just different. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Randy, for sharing yourself and your life and your story with us. We need to hear that. Randy's going to be in the fellowship hall after this, and we're just going to have some conversation. So we invite you to come and be a part of that, and then we'll be back in here for worship again. He'll do again what he's done tonight. Would you stand and let's pray together? God, it's not easy to walk through this valley, and as we have heard and as we've experienced in our own lives, it's a road that none of us choose. And I am so thankful that as our shepherd, you are there with us. You don't leave us alone. And at times you pick us up and carry us. At times you just walk beside us, but you always love us and always care for us. And for that I am thankful. God, help us to take what we have experienced and learned this morning and turn it outward, and to also be a shepherd for others and walk with them, carry them sometimes, but just always be present, and to know how to grieve and mourn and to live well in you. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. Thank you.